What if the most foundational belief of the modern world was built upon a calculated mistranslation designed to keep you in spiritual debt? For centuries, global empires have promoted a legalistic version of the cross, framing the death of Jesus as a cold transaction to satisfy an angry deity, a doctrine that conveniently mirrors the way earthly kings manage their subjects through debt and punishment. But while Rome was busy engineering a faith that served the state, a radical, unedited voice was being guarded in the vertical wilderness of East Africa, far beyond the reach of imperial censors. In the stone-carved monasteries of Ethiopia, the story is not about a legal verdict. It is about an internal revolution that the masters of this world desperately tried to bury under layers of tradition. The journey to recover this silenced history leads us to the Simeon Mountains, where the landscape itself serves as a fortress for ancient memory. Here, at the monastery of Gund, monks have spent over 15 centuries engaged in spiritual warfare against the forces of forgetting, copying manuscripts by hand that were long ago labeled dangerous by Western councils. When a sealed leather satchel is finally opened at this exact moment, it doesn't reveal a set of religious rules, but a direct address concerning the kingdom within, a concept so disruptive that it effectively dismantles every human hierarchy that claims to mediate between you and the divine. This is the Jesus that power could not control, an awakener of souls rather than a builder of institutions. Scientific verification has now caught up with these ancient claims, confirming that the goat leather codices found in these monasteries date back to the 4th or 5th century, the very era when the Roman Empire was weaponizing Christianity for political unity. These texts are not medieval inventions. They are eyewitness accounts to a broader, deeper faith that prioritized personal awakening over imperial compliance. As we step into the sanctuaries that refuse to let their archives be trimmed for a king's shelf, we are forced to ask, are you following a religion designed to manage you, or are you ready for the truth that was meant to set you free? The conversation did not end 2,000 years ago. It was merely hidden. And right now, the mountains are finally speaking again. The historical survival of these disruptive manuscripts was never a matter of chance, but rather a direct result of Ethiopia's unique position as a sovereign spiritual powerhouse that existed entirely outside the reach of Roman imperial influence. While the Mediterranean world was undergoing a forced unification under the sword of Constantine, the kingdom of Aksum had already embraced a version of the faith that was African at its wellspring and independent in its execution. This was not a religion imported through colonial roads, but a profound spiritual movement that took root in the 4th century, long before the centralized authorities of Europe began to trim the edges of sacred scripture to fit a political outline. Because the Ethiopian church leaned on a decentralized network of monastic communities, it was able to preserve a library that remained immune to the censorship of the West. Geography served as the ultimate silent witness and protection, with the rugged plateaus of the Simeon Mountains acting as natural ramparts against the erasure of history. In a world where conquerors often consolidated power by rewriting the past, Ethiopia's vertical fortresses made it nearly impossible for foreign invaders to monitor what was being copied within the stone walls. These remote sanctuaries became a safe haven for manuscripts that Rome eventually labeled as inconvenient, dangerous, or heretical, such as the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. For the monks of the highlands, the act of preservation was not merely a preservation of paper, but an act of spiritual warfare intended to keep the original, unmuted melody of the faith alive. The Ethiopian monastic tradition viewed the work of the scribe as a holy ministry of endurance, where every stroke of the pen was a refusal to let the sacred narrative be managed like imperial property. Unlike the centers of power in the Roman world, the guardians of Aksum remained stewards of what they had received without seeking official permission to exist. This culture of devotion meant that when other traditions narrowed their canons, Ethiopia widened its archives to include the full spectrum of early Christian revelation. By standing beyond the easy reach of empires, they ensured that the version of Jesus who awakened the soul remained intact, protected by the very mountains that refused to forget. Ultimately, the isolation of these monasteries created a spiritual vault that allowed the kingdom within to thrive as an interior reality, free from the machinery of external control. The monks understood that a people who realize the holy is not only above them, but also within them, are a people who cannot be easily ruled from the outside. This foundational belief in personal awakening, rather than institutional dependency, is what defines the manuscripts found in the leather satchels of Gund. As we investigate these ancient folios at this exact moment, we are not just looking at old ink on goatskin, but at the remnants of a living revolution that was successfully shielded from the editing eyes of an empire. The manuscripts shielded within the Ethiopian highlands do more than just preserve the past. They act as a profound theological mirror that exposes the deep-seated distortions of our modern era. In the Western world, faith is often presented as a consumer product designed to personal comfort and the fulfillment of the American dream. This modern gospel suggests that the primary goal of the divine is to ensure our physical health, financial prosperity, and temporal security. However, the voices echoing from the stone monasteries of Gund tell a much different and more sobering story, asserting that the cross was never intended to be a tool for amassing material wealth or achieving earthly comfort. One of the most pervasive myths in contemporary religious teaching is the idea that material abundance is a guaranteed sign of divine favor. This perspective is not only a departure from the historical reality of the early church, but it also marginalizes millions of believers worldwide who endure immense persecution and poverty. The Ethiopian tradition understands that God's presence is not measured by the accumulation of possessions, but by the resilience of the human spirit under the weight of suffering. True riches, as defined by these ancient texts, are found in the immeasurable grace and kindness of Christ, a spiritual flourishing that can exist even in the most impoverished of circumstances. Furthermore, we must confront the modern habit of turning the name of Jesus into a convenient political instrument to legitimize personal ideologies or cultural isms. Whether used to promote progressive social agendas or conservative platforms, the message of Christ is often stripped of its sovereign authority and forced into the narrow confines of human political systems. The Ethiopian manuscripts remind us that Jesus is not a conservative Republican or a progressive Democrat, but God, whose coming kingdom was inaugurated to replace our fragile and corrupt human institutions. By focusing so intensely on these fleeting political causes, modern society neglects the supreme and eternal message of the gospel, the atoning death and the reality of a kingdom that is not of this world. There is also a widespread and subtle deception, suggesting that grace functions as a spiritual license to remain stagnant in our internal nature. This view treats salvation as a static legal contract that covers our failures, without ever requiring a radical recalibration of our hearts or our desires. But the testimony preserved in the African mountains argues that Jesus died specifically so that we could change, breaking the chains of our autonomy to make us entirely dependent on the divine. Salvation is described as a slow, steady march that kills off our love for self-glory and grows a profound, humble love for the eternal, moving us to take Jesus' side against our own sin. Finally, These ancient records dismantle the human tendency to seek a moral checklist that allows us to feel superior to those who cannot meet our self-imposed standards. Many modern believers have become comfortable with a manageable moral code, using it as a spiritual resume to pass judgment on others, while ignoring the pride and self-righteousness in their own hearts. These manuscripts reveal that our religious doing is utterly insufficient, and that every soul, regardless of their social standing, is equally in need of the redemption found at the foot of the cross. By embracing this truth at this exact moment, we move away from a faith of outward performance and toward a life of genuine awakening, anchored in a righteousness that we did not earn and cannot manage through our own power. The mid-20th century discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran provided a staggering archaeological bridge to the very library that Ethiopia had been guarding in secret for nearly 2 millennia. When ancient clay jars were unsealed in those remote desert caves, researchers found fragments of texts, like the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch, which had been meticulously copied and cherished by Jewish communities long before the formation of modern religious canons. In fact, these caves contained more copies of the Book of Jubilees than many books now found in a standard Protestant Bible, proving that for the early seekers of faith, these were not extra writings, but essential spiritual bread. While the Western world eventually allowed these works to fade into the silence of footnotes, the Ethiopian tradition kept them at the absolute center of their spiritual life, recognizing them as a vital map of the divine order. The Book of Jubilees functions as a cosmic blueprint that organizes the fabric of time and worship through a precise sacred rhythm that remains untouched by human interference. It introduces a 3-6-4-day solar calendar that aligns perfectly with the cycles of weeks and seasons, ensuring that holy feasts and Sabbaths never drift from their intended divine frequency. For the ancient communities that chose a disciplined life in the wilderness, this calendar was more than just a schedule. It was a form of spiritual resistance against a corrupt world that had lost its rhythm. Within this library, the Sabbath is revealed not as a later legalistic rule, but as a cosmic reality that was honored in heaven by angels long before humanity ever drew its first breath. Beyond the regulation of time, these suppressed books pull back the curtain on the spiritual warfare that defines the human struggle against the hidden origins of evil. They explain the existence of roaming unclean spirits, disembodied remnants permitted to test humanity under a dark overseer named Mastema, providing the necessary context for the spiritual battles described throughout the New Testament. This library also repeatedly references the heavenly tablets, a celestial archive where every divine promise, commandment, and human deed is permanently inscribed beyond the reach of earthly censors. By preserving these specific details, the Ethiopian Codex provides the behind-the-scenes map that makes the spiritual gravity and moral weight of the present life finally understandable. The eventual sidelining of these books in the West was the result of a calculated pattern of sectarian rivalry, calendar conflicts, and the pressure to simplify the religious narrative for imperial control. As official doctrines narrowed under the oversight of Roman councils, any text that taught decentralized authority or a complex spiritual worldview became an inconvenience for those who sought centralized power. Silence became a powerful tool of exclusion over many generations. Yet that silence was never absolute, because the themes of the Book of Jubilees continued to vibrate beneath the surface of the Gospels. Today, by reopening this ancient African library at this exact moment, we are not inventing a new faith, but recovering a shattered mirror that allows us to see the full, unedited reflection of the ancient spiritual world. The Ethiopian manuscripts perform a radical act of historical restoration by naming Mary Magdalene, without shrinking her authority or redefining her identity through the lens of moral shame. While Western traditions often reshaped her into a symbol of disgrace to serve a specific institutional narrative, the ancient folios of Gund list her among the inner circle during the master's final and deepest instructions. In these records, she's standing alongside Peter, John, and James as a primary participant in the transfer of spiritual weight, recognized not as a background character, but as an essential pillar of the early movement. This unedited voice refuses to apologize for her presence, revealing a version of history where spiritual proximity was determined by perception rather than gender or social rank. Within the flow of the manuscript, Mary Magdalene is distinguished by a title that functions as a divine commissioning, the one who understands. This title suggests a level of spiritual perception that allowed her to grasp the profound nature of the kingdom within, while others struggled with the surface-level mechanics of religion. She is depicted as the disciple who asks the most difficult and demanding questions, pressing for clarity on the hidden things of God, and receiving direct, intimate answers in return. By affirming that she sees with her soul, the Master validates an internal authority that cannot be manufactured by earthly titles or managed by the machinery of an empire. The systemic sidelining of such voices is not a requirement written into the foundation of faith, but was instead a result of political evolution. As the early church began to mirror the structures of human power, as institutions sought stability and predictability, they instinctively adopted the patriarchal hierarchies of the Roman world, which required silencing any voice that disrupted the official chain of command. The Ethiopian library stands as a stubborn witness against this adaptation, preserving a memory where women were thinkers, questioners, and trusted recipients of sacred truth. By recovering this narrative, we realize that the marginalization of Mary Magdalene was a calculated effort to ensure that spiritual authority remained centralized, but easily regulated by state-sanctioned gatekeepers. Ultimately, the voice of Mary Magdalene in these manuscripts represents the ultimate threat to imperial control, the awakened conscience of an individual who does not need external permission to touch holiness. Empires can govern temples and regulate rituals, but they struggle to manage a people who believe that divine insight is available to anyone who sees with their soul. The Ethiopian tradition reminds us that the center of spiritual gravity was always intended to be broader and more inclusive than any earthly kingdom could comfortably allow. As we listen to this silenced voice at this exact moment, we are invited to reconsider not just the role of women in history, but the very nature of an awakening that refuses to be tamed by the logic of power. The manuscripts preserved within the Ethiopian highlands provide a radical reframing of the crucifixion that refuses to fit into the restrictive, legalistic language so common in modern religious traditions. For centuries, many have been taught to view the death of Jesus primarily as a commercial transaction, a payment offered to satisfy an angry deity, as if mercy had to be purchased before it could be released. However, the ancient voices from Gund record a different tone, one where the Master explicitly states that he does not suffer so that humanity no longer has to, but rather to reveal the definitive way through suffering. This shifts the entire center of gravity from a cold legal exchange to a profound spiritual revelation, insisting that the cross is not just something done for you in a distant theological past, but something that happens in you as you learn to endure with faith. This change in perspective fundamentally alters how a person understands both God's character and their own life journey, moving them away from a passive faith toward an active path of transformation. If the cross is framed solely as a transaction, the believer becomes a mere recipient of a verdict who repeats a formula and waits for a future reward. But the Ethiopian tradition presents Jesus as a companion to the oppressed, the wounded, and the betrayed, showing that suffering is not a proof of abandonment, but a doorway to courage. By stepping into pain without surrendering love and facing injustice without becoming unjust, he demonstrated a divine solidarity that awakens the internal strength of those who are crushed by violence. In this light, the crucifixion is seen as a direct challenge to imperial thinking because it produces disciples who do not collapse under external pressure. The Master's example forms resilient individuals who can stand in the fire of life and still speak truth, love, and hope without being owned by the evil they face. This is a liberating cross because it does not merely remove condemnation. It produces character, resilience, and a unique form of spiritual authority that is inwardly anchored. It is the difference between a faith that settled a legal case and a faith that heals a people, turning a heart into a vessel of living revolution that no earthly power can manipulate. Rome and the global empires that followed often preferred a legalistic cross because law and official verdicts are the primary tools through which empires manage and regulate populations. A transactional cross can be turned into an instrument of control, keeping the population dependent on an institution that claims to be the sole distributor of grace. Ethiopia, however, protected a different emphasis, a cross that does not simply declare you forgiven, but calls you to awaken and participate in a path of holiness. By viewing the crucified Christ as a companion rather than a contract, the Ethiopian library offers a version of faith that sustains the soul through darkness while keeping its human dignity entirely intact. The final and most disruptive truth preserved within the Ethiopian archives is the realization that the kingdom within is not a future destination or a distant theological theory, but a present internal reality that demands an immediate awakening. This ancient voice challenges the instinct to search for the divine only through external systems, far-off promises, or polished sanctuaries that remain perpetually beyond reach. By focusing on the hidden interior, where the spirit heals and strengthens, the manuscripts dismantle the idea that holiness must be managed by imperial machinery or official gatekeepers. This Jesus is revealed not as a builder of religious institutions that rely on dependency and mediation, but as an awakener of souls who calls for a faith that is personal, and inwardly anchored. We must sit with the mirror that these manuscripts hold up to our modern lives and ask if we are truly ready to hear a gospel that exists beyond the reach of human empire. If the center of spiritual authority is located in the living encounter between God and the soul, then your access to the holy is not dependent on a throne, a council, a title, or a seal. You do not need an emperor's favor to pray and be heard, nor do you need permission to awaken, because an awakened conscience is precisely what the kingdom within produces. This internal reign changes how you think, how you love, and how you endure suffering without ever surrendering your dignity to the evil you resist. The storm we face today, the shifting sands of culture, politics, and power, is not designed to break us, but to expose the foundation upon which our lives are built. Both Rome and Ethiopia heard the same words, yet while one sought to regulate faith through legalism and control, the other sought to protect it through devotion and the silence of the mountains. The voice of the Master now reaches out from the dusty hills of Galilee and the stone walls of Gund, asking if you will choose to build on the shifting sand of human approval or the rock of a truth that does not move when everything else does. We are invited to move past the habits of ritual and the pursuit of a moral checklist returning to a faith that was lived in the body and in the quiet place where God speaks to a willing heart. Ultimately, the conversation that began 2,000 years ago was never truly ended, but was merely silenced by those who feared a people who no longer needed permission to be free. The library of the ancestors is now open, and the echoes of the original melody are returning to a generation that has grown tired of sanitized and controlled narratives. As the satchel is closed and the silence of the highlands remains, the weight of the testimony rests with you, inviting you to keep questioning, keep awakening, and keep the faith. The kingdom is not a contract to be filed away, but a living revolution that plants its roots where no empire can ever confiscate it. If this journey into the mountains of Ethiopia and the hidden archives of the ancestors has stirred something within your spirit, do not let that flame fade once this video ends. We invite you to join this growing community of seekers by subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell, ensuring that you do not miss the next deep dive into the truths that history tried to bury. Your engagement is more than just a metric. It is a declaration that you value a faith that refuses to be edited and a truth that demands to be lived. By liking and sharing this video, you are helping this message reach those who are currently walking through their own storms, offering them the same rock of resilience that the Ethiopian monks have guarded for over 15 centuries. We also invite you to stand up in the comments below and share your testimony or your location, letting us know where in the world you are watching from, as you choose the kingdom within over the systems of the world. If you are ready to build your life on the rock of Christ's unedited words rather than the shifting sands of human approval, type Aksum in the comments right now as a sign of your commitment to this living revolution. This conversation did not end 2,000 years ago. It is only now beginning to speak again through those who have the courage to listen, to question, and to awaken. Thank you for walking this path with us. And until next time, remember that the truth survives only when the people have the strength to protect it.